and welcome back to Otaku no Video. As always, thank you very much for joining me for part 2 of my primer on Studio Ghibli. In my last segment, I talked about the prehistory of the company and how it formed around the movie Nausicaa: The Valley of Wind. And Nausicaa did well enough and was enough of a proof of concept that Hayao Miyazaki was able to get the funding together to make another film. And he basically got those same animators together and formed a permanent company, Studio Ghibli. They retroactively pulled in the rights for Nausicaa as kind of their first film, although it was made technically before they actually incorporated. And they started work on their next film, another original one by Hayao Miyazaki called Laputa: Castle in the Sky. Castle in the Sky is interesting because it recycles several elements from earlier Hayao Miyazaki works, like Future Boy Conan, a TV series he made, and Lupin III. And it's also a film aimed at a younger audience. The two protagonists are preteen children, and the adventure is a little more light and goofy. It has environmental messages, but they kind of take a back seat to the adventure, if you will. Not to say The Castle in the Sky is a completely light movie. It is very interesting on its own terms, but it is mostly action-adventure. Now, Castle in the Sky was... it did okay. It was not a huge breakout success, but again, it established the fact that Hayao Miyazaki could make a solid film. And he made an interesting one out of that. And again, this gave him enough credibility to move on and make more things. And his buddy, Isao Takahata, who had formed Studio Ghibli with him, decided to make a movie too. So they both made their own movies within Studio Ghibli and released them both as a double billing. So you'd go into the theater and you'd see both of these films back to back. My Neighbor Totoro and Grave of the Fireflies. Now, if you've ever seen both of these films, you know what a horrible idea it would be to play these films back to back. Totoro, Miyazaki's movie, is a children's film about a couple of young girls moving into a new house and kind of the adventures they have. It's very light. There are no antagonists. Almost nothing bad happens in the film. There are a few misunderstandings, but it's a very light, fun film and brilliant in its own way. But definitely a kid's film. The other is an adaptation of a novel about children suffering during World War II, and basically how people were starving to death during World War II and all the difficulties thereof, and the great angst that the author had over the horrible traumas he suffered during World War II as a boy. Wow. Here's the thing, though. These films both came out in 1988. There wasn't a lot of good anime for children at the time. So My Neighbor Totoro, I mean, anime was in the middle of the whole big mecha swing, and it started to grow up, and we'd had Gundam, we'd had Macross starting up, so anime was definitely skewing more towards teenagers. And Miyazaki wanted something that his girls could, his young children could see. So he made Totoro, which was kind of based off of an earlier OVA he'd done. But Totoro was seen as a really good children's film. Not just something you can sit kids in front of, but a really solidly structured story, and one with no freaking antagonist. How did he do it? Grave of the Fireflies was remarkable because it was a respected literary work. And the fact that Takahata adapted that for the screen as an anime successfully established the fact that anime could tell quality literary works in a way that was effective. It really got that across in a way that really wouldn't have worked as well in live action. And there's actually proof of that now because there was a live action adaptation of Grave of the Fireflies done a few years ago. And it's impressive, but it doesn't work quite in the same way. So Grave of the Fireflies got a lot of critical attention for being, a good film like that. And this film also made a lot of the festival circuit. Roger Ebert was talking about Grave of the Fireflies when it came out. So it was a big thing. Then a year later, Hayao Miyazaki released another film. This time it was an adaptation of a children's book called Kiki's Delivery Service. And this is a film aimed at teen girls, young teen girls, 13-year-old girls basically, about a 13-year-old girl who's on her own for the first time. And so it's about adolescence, it's about growing up, it's about selfish childhood things, childishness, and how at some point we have to grow out of that. We have to figure out what we're going to do, what we're willing to do to pursue being an independent person. And this was the big one. Kiki's Delivery Service was hugely popular, very popular. This put Miyazaki and Studio Ghibli on the map, at least in Japan. Super stardom. Stardom of Kiki's Delivery Service. This was it. Again, this was 1989. With this, Studio Ghibli now had cachet, and just seeing Studio Ghibli on a film was enough to get people to come in and watch it. 2 years later, Isao Takahata would come back to make a very personal film called Only Yesterday. This is a film about a young woman who has a successful career in the city and decides to take a sabbatical, go back to her hometown in the country, and just sort of take stock of her life. Catch up with the people she grew up with who are still living out there, kind of get back in touch with those things. That is intercut with her memories of her as a child and the things she experienced, some of the trauma she experienced and things like that. And this is a much more complex film than I think a lot of people give it credit for. There's a lot of memory involved in this, and it's about people coming to grips with themselves, which is something that a lot of movies try to cover but don't do very well, or they get wrapped up in their own story. Only Yesterday really focuses on that. It's a really interesting film, and if you can find it, certainly grab it. Also interesting for the fact that they use some rotoscoping in there, but that's a whole other animation thing. I don't want to bore you with that. So Takahata's second original film did well. Yeah. A year later, Hayao Miyazaki released his next film. This was because an airline approached him and said, would you be willing to do a short film that we can show during short flights, so sort of island hopping flights. You do like a 20-minute film or something. And he came up with an idea which eventually grew into a whole movie called Porco Rosso. This is an adventure film about a World War I pilot who has a curse. He's cursed to look like a pig, although he's a human otherwise. And he has these sort of adventures in the Mediterranean during the rise of fascism, basically. And it's more of a light film, it's more of an adventure-y film, it's a fun film, but the main character is a sort of middle-aged, grumpy guy, and he was remarkable for that fact. And again, beautiful animation, all that, but very interesting film, primarily for being a film about middle-aged people, which we don't get too much of in anime. So, yes, at this point, Studio Ghibli was about, well, we'll say about 6 years old, and a lot of the animators had moved on, new animators had moved in, and the new guard, so to speak, wanted to sort of prove themselves. So Tomomi Mochizuki, a little hard to pronounce, who was one of the sort of the new guard, was elected to, or was told, to make a TV film, made for TV film, which he made called Ocean Waves, or I Can Hear the Sea, depending on how you want to translate that. This is a story which I could never get into. Basically, it's about a guy who's in high school and then college. It covers him over the course of several years. And he falls in love with a girl in class that kind of nobody likes and is very unlikable. And it's about his relationship with this girl. Remarkable for the fact that it's basically a romance. There's really no fantasy involved. It is just a story about teenagers in love. And it could have very well have been live action, but it was animated instead. And it also, because it's a TV movie, it lacks some of the lushness of a big budget Studio Ghibli theater film, although it certainly doesn't look bad, but definitely a different kind of thing. And it was made primarily because the Studio Ghibli needed to keep on producing more material to keep all these animators working. Let's see here, so that's Ocean Waves. Okay, a year later, Isao Takahata, the other guy, the Grave of the Fireflies guy, released his next film called Pom Poko. Now, Pom Poko is about tanuki, which are sort of a Japanese raccoon. It's an environmental story. Their forest is being torn down to make condominiums, essentially. And they decide to fight back. Now, tanuki in Japanese culture have this camouflaging ability, and this ability to, well, to use their balls. Really. They can stretch their balls and create huge illusions using them. And this is animated quite clearly in the film. I can't explain it, but it works. It's a really charming film. And because it's about these intelligent little critters, and they can all talk, of course, trying to figure out how to save their habitat from humanity. And they can do these various tricks to freak out humans. But ultimately, they can't fight progress. And so it's this interesting story about the limits of environmentalism and how much you can really do. And it's this broad fantasy film. I mean, lots of crazy stuff. There's this awesome processional festival sequence near the end of the film. It's just stunning. And it ends kind of sadly. I won't spoil it, but it's not a whole big happy ending, which is interesting for a Studio Ghibli film. Meanwhile, the folks at Ghibli were still trying to do new projects, and Miyazaki was interested in getting one of the animators there to direct something. So Miyazaki went out and he found a manga that they could adapt. It was called Whisper of the Heart, a story about a young teenage girl and her emotional struggles. A shoujo story. No fantasy elements at all. He was partly interested in this because by this point Studio Ghibli had this reputation. They did basically fantasy films. Think Nausicaa the Valley, or science fiction films. Nausicaa, Castle in the Sky, Porco Rosso, Kikis Delivery Service, they all have some fantasy or science fiction element in them. And they were being kind of dismissed by the Japanese critics as only capable of these outlandish fantasy stories. So Miyazaki wanted to do a story that had no fantasy, no science fiction elements. He chose Whisper of the Heart, which is this urban story, and he got Yoshifumi Kondo, an animator there, to direct it. Miyazaki actually directed the dream sequences. He also storyboarded it, so it's kind of his film anyway. Anyway, it was really seen as Kondo's film. Whisper of the Heart is my favorite Studio Ghibli film. It is a beautiful story of a young girl trying to figure out herself. I can't say enough good things about it. And it is an urban story. It is set in an urban landscape about real, normal, modern-day humans. And interestingly, as kind of a proof to critics that they could tell a serious story, the first shot of Whisper of the Heart is the same as the last shot of Pom Poko, which shows the city that's being built. Whisper of the Heart is set in the city that was attacking the tanuki in Pom Poko. So it's kind of showing the effects of our environmental choices. The fact that yes, that happens to these tanuki, but then that allows this story to happen. So Whisper of the Heart is, well, I won't go more about how much I love that film. I love that film. And got a lot of attention for being a very interesting film. Unfortunately, this would be Kondo's last film. He died not long after. But it was a very interesting film and a very remarkable one. So I've been talking here about sort of the center, I would almost say the early golden age of Studio Ghibli. This was when Ghibli really came onto the map, really made it some of its best work, and was really garnering a lot of attention, and folks were just loving everything that Studio Ghibli made. And this will continue for a while. And in the next segment, I'm going to talk a bit about some of Studio Ghibli's later works in the late 90s, and it's going to be quite an interesting ride, so stay tuned.